Today's notes are titled Hoover's Response to the Great Depression. So it's Unit 4, Notes number 6. So in these notes, we're going to look to see how President Hoover reacts to the Great Depression and how he involves government in trying to combat the Great Depression. Hoover tries to reassure the nation. After the stock market crash of 1929, President Herbert Hoover tried to reassure Americans that the nation's economy was on a sound footing. In his view, the important thing was for Americans to remain optimistic. He didn't want Americans to panic, and to be fair, no one at the time knew how bad the Great Depression would get. He believed that periods of rapid economic growth were naturally followed by periods of depression. Hoover felt that the government should play a limited role in helping to solve problems. So, again, this is a time before unemployment and food stamps. So, the role of the government was very different back then. The government did not have that responsibility that people kind of assume they should do today. So, he felt that people should kind of figure things out for themselves and the government shouldn't intervene with the economy. Americans at the time also valued rugged individualism, the idea that people should succeed through their own efforts, that they should take care of themselves and their families and not rely on the government. So, for many people, even though they were struggling with the Great Depression, in their minds, they felt that they needed to be the ones to solve their problems. They were not necessarily comfortable, asking for help, getting help from other people, other organizations. And so they weren't necessarily ready to accept help or necessarily think the government should be helping them out at the time. They were very, very independent, didn't want to have to rely on other people. Hoover opposed any form of federal welfare or direct relief to the needy. His answer to the needy was that individuals, charities, and local organizations should pitch in to help care for the less fortunate. Hoover takes cautious steps. Soon after the stock market crash, Hoover called together key leaders in the fields of business, banking, and labor. He urged them to work together to find solutions. So he didn't pass laws. He didn't make them do anything. He's asking them to do all of this stuff voluntarily. So it gets referred to as voluntary action. Hoover asked employers not to cut wages or lay off workers, and he asked labor leaders not to demand higher wages or go on strike. So, of course, since this is voluntary, companies will cut wages, lay off workers if they feel that they need to, because there's nothing really making them stick with it. He also created a special organization to help private charities generate contributions for the poor. None of these steps made much of a difference. A year after the crash, the economy was still shrinking and unemployment was still rising. More companies went out of business, soup kitchens became a common sight, and general misery grew. Shanty towns arose in every city, and hobos continued to roam. So, as the Depression worsens, what we see is this downward spiral. We see that when people lose jobs, they stop shopping. So, they stop spending money in businesses, which means more businesses close, more people are unemployed, and that cycle continues. People don't have money, they can't pay rent, they can't buy things, they're not shopping, more businesses go under, there's more unemployment. And so it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse as the cycle continues. The Boulder Dam. One project that Hoover approved did make a difference: the construction of the Boulder Dam, which is now called the Hoover Dam, relatively close to Las Vegas. It was approved in 1928, as part of a $700 million public works program by Congress. The government funded the construction and created jobs in the process. So, this idea of public works, where the government pays for something to be done. And so, this is one of the kind of first projects that we see like this, and it's coming around at the right time where people need jobs. The government's paying for it, is creating this dam that will provide a source of hydroelectric power, water supply to the region. So it's functioning to provide benefit for the people. So they're not just paying people to do nothing, they're building something that will have long lasting effects. In addition to providing electricity and flood control, the dam also provided a regular water supply, which enabled the growth of California's agricultural economy. Today, the dam helps to provide water to Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Hoover takes action. As time went on and the Depression worsened, President Hoover gradually softened his position on government intervention. He began to see that as president, the government should probably do something. In 1931, Hoover appealed to Congress to pass a series of measures to reform banking, provide mortgage relief, and funnel more federal money into business investment. So, still, it's not the direct aid that people wanted. So, to give you guys a comparison, it's like a stimulus check where people needed money. They needed to pay bills, they needed to buy food for their family, they needed to pay rent. They needed the help, but the money's going to the banking industry, to banks to provide mortgage relief, and to other businesses. So the money he is providing, the aid he is giving, is for companies. In 1932, Hoover signed into law the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans and avoid foreclosures. So this allows people to try to lower what they pay in their mortgage to make it more affordable, to make it so that they don't get kicked out onto the street. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, was approved by Congress in January of 1932. It authorized up to $2 billion for emergency financing for banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and other large businesses. So again, we see that aid is being provided, but to companies and corporations. Hoover believed that the money would trickle down to the average citizen through job growth and higher wages. That by giving money to these companies, they will hire back workers, they'll increase pay, but that did not happen. So let's stop and think. How did Hoover try to combat the Great Depression, and were his efforts successful? So initially, Hoover begins by not thinking anything should be done, that this is just a natural cycle within the economy. We've seen depressions and recessions before, and so we just need to be optimistic and we'll power through. But when that doesn't work, we see his reluctance to provide direct aid to the people. We do see a public works project through the Boulder Dam come about, but again, that was just one project. And then when we do finally see some of his efforts to get legislation passed, it's mostly to banks and businesses, not to the people. So really, his efforts were not successful. The depression got worse and worse and worse every year of his presidential term. So the election of 1932. The 1932 presidential election showed that Americans were ready for a change. Too many Americans blamed Hoover for doing too little to combat the Depression. They wanted a new president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, was a Democrat. He had been governor of New York, and so he ran against Hoover in 1932. FDR won the election with an overwhelming victory, capturing nearly 23 million votes to Hoover's 16 million votes. And so that's the popular vote count. And maybe during class or in our Zoom, I'll show you what the electoral map looked like. Because with the electoral college map, it almost looks like it's a complete landslide with Hoover winning very, very few states. So the Democrats also won majorities in the House and the Senate, so in Congress. And so what we see here is that Hoover was a Republican, that people are not liking the Republican policies during the first part of the Great Depression. So when you have this next election, they're instead voting for Democrats because they want new, they want change. They do not like the way the Republicans had been managing the Great Depression. America waits for a New Deal. While waiting to be inaugurated in March of 1933, FDR worked with a team of carefully picked advisors known as the Brain Trust. FDR began to formulate a set of policies for his new administration. The program was designed to alleviate the problems of the Great Depression, became known as the New Deal. So at this time, the president didn't get inaugurated until March. So from November to be elected, and then have to wait almost 5 months until they're in office. It's a long period. So this was the last time that happened. And then the 20th Amendment was passed, changing the inauguration date to January 20th. So that way it's not such a long delay before the new president, the new administration kicks in. New Deal policies would focus on three general goals: relief for the needy, economic recovery, and financial reform, known as the three R's: relief, recovery, reform. Once FDR took office, his administration launched a period of intense activity known as the 100 Days, lasting from March 9th to June 6, 1933. During this period, Congress passed 15 major pieces of New Deal legislation. These laws would significantly expand the role of the federal government in the nation's economy. Roosevelt's first steps as president would be to carry out reforms in the banking and finance industries. Banking reform. By 1933, widespread bank failures had caused most Americans to lose faith in the banking system. One day after taking office, FDR declared a bank holiday where all banks would be closed and closed all banks to prevent further withdrawals. Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, which authorized the Treasury Department to inspect the country's banks. Those that were sound could reopen at once. Those that were unable to pay their debts would remain closed. This measure revived public confidence in banks. Congress also passed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, which established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, also known as FDIC, which is still around today. This provided federal insurance for individual bank accounts up to $5,000, and the limit has been increased since then. So what this does is to prevent banks from closing, from people from rushing to withdraw all their money because they know their money is insured. Congress and the president also worked to regulate the stock market. The Federal Securities Act was passed, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was created to regulate the stock market to prevent any type of insider trading, risky practices that could lead to other stock market crashes. Fireside Chats. FDR would use fireside chats, radio talks about issues of public concern. He would explain in clear, simple language the purpose and goals of his New Deal measures. These informal talks made Americans feel as if the president were talking directly to them. In his first fireside chat on March 5th, 1933, he explained the process behind closing and reopening banks, what the bank holiday was all about, what the Treasury Department was doing, so that way the public understood that once a bank reopened, the government has certified that it's healthy, that it's safe to put your money back in those banks, and that banks that stayed closed were going to be worked on and repaired, get help from the government so that they could eventually reopen. And so by sending this information directly to the American public, they're understanding the process, and they're having more trust in their government. So let's stop and think. How does FDR's approach to dealing with the Great Depression differ from Hoover's? So already we're starting to see a more active approach. He has a plan. He recognizes that the Great Depression is a problem. And we're starting to see a combination of not only direct relief to the public, but also this idea of recovery and reform. So he wants to give the people relief, and we'll talk about more of those types of programs next week or later in the notes this week. Recovery for the economy, kind of fix the things that went wrong, and also reform, realize what problems existed and try to correct those again. So he's just trying to make lots of changes to move quickly, isn't trying to maybe ignore the problem like Hoover had tried. He's also involving the public a lot more with things like his fireside chats compared to Hoover. So we're done with the notes. Go back, look at your key terms, and then review the notes.